Before I start, how many people have already taken one of the classes available on CAR on this contract? All but one, only one, okay?
I was waiting for yours.
You're waiting for
Yeah,
mine.
so was that. You know, I was gonna sign up for one of those classes that is so
Say, why spend $75? I can get Steve for free.
Well, and then I looked at that, it says 75, and I thought, well, I need to know about this stuff, so I clicked the next button, and all of a sudden it was 150. I thought, no, I don't want two of them. Like, anyway, so I didn't.
How many, does everyone have a handout? Okay, we need, who doesn't have a handout? Raise your hand. We're lost if you don't have a handout. How many people are seeing the new contract for the first time? Have people never seen it until they get it today? Just what, about half a dozen of you or so? Okay. Now, don't ask me what the colors, I tried to figure out, and don't ask me what all the colors mean. I mean, I sat there and went through and tried to figure out exactly what they were trying to come up with. Everyone got one now? I know some of them are changes, some of them are new things, some of them are things that were tweaked and so forth. Bottom line is, a lot of the stuff you need to know is highlighted. There's more there that I'll point out as we go through. One other thing up front is today's class is a 4-hour class. Hopefully we can keep it to that. Gov Hutchinson spent an hour and a half going over questions.
I don't see how you can.
After the 4-hour class.
Yeah, I don't see how you can.
Yeah. Well, I'm only going through the changes. This is not, what we're doing is not a contracts class. For those of you who attended my today, we're going through we're going to highlight the changes. On the 8th, the same thing. I'm going to do it again. So you're welcome to come back again, or if you have to leave or whatever. We're going to go through changes. I'd like to keep the questions down to a minimum if possible, but if you have a burning question, if you just simply don't understand what it is I'm telling you or what this document says, raise your hand and that's fine, okay? Now, on the 16th and the 17th, I think it's 9 to 4, now I'm going to do a full-blown contracts class. Okay, so I'm going to, just like all my previous contract classes, but it's going to be on the new one, okay? But I'll go through the whole thing like I have in the past.
For those, myself included, what do you cover in that, like specifically?
I go through every clause in the contract, and I give you war stories, and I give you tips from a seller standpoint, I give you tips from a buyer standpoint. I tell you what things mean. I point out red flags in areas where there's gotchas if you don't keep track of what's there. So and when you get done with that 2-day class, you should understand the contract pretty well. The other thing, in case I forget, what I suggest to you is after you leave today, you as homework, you practice writing an offer on this form. And then bring it, and then if you want, bring it back on the 8th. And then you can share any questions you have after you've gone through it. Now now understand, folks, on the 14th, the old contract's gone. It goes away. Whoops. This is it as of the 14th. So you're gonna it's gonna be if you got to write an offer on the 15th, this is the contract you're gonna find when you go on zip forms. Yeah.
So you get in contract on the old contract prior to the changes. Changes take place. How do you make addendums that are brand new to the old contract or whatever?
Yeah. You continue with your good question. You continue with your existing contract. You don't change the contract. You continue with that contract. The changes that they've made revisions to as many as 92 forms because you changed the format, they've got to change all these forms so it's consistent with the contract. But the changes aren't significant enough that you have to worry about the content of most of the forms, okay? I mean, the main ones that they added or changed have been changed for this. You can still use the addendum form, you can use the proposed amendment to an existing contract. You can use the notice to perform and so forth. You don't have to worry about the fact that they may not be 100% in line with your old contract. But that's a good question. That came up a lot.
We have templates sent up for various transactions. What's gonna happen to the templates? Will they be automatically replaced by the new form? So we gotta.
You gotta
delete
design,
them
as
all
I
and-
understand, you gotta set up all new templates. That's my understanding, yeah. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, I've been worrying about that, but basically, this is still most of this is still the same.
Yeah,
It's just
yeah.
the where things are arranged.
Right, yes, yeah, that's what I was gonna get to next, is
Yeah.
basically just understand that normally, for the longest time, they've been trying to keep the contract at 10 pages. And every time they make changes, they'll take a few things out and move things around. And they've tried for years and years to keep it at 10. But they finally threw up their hands and said, there's just too much stuff we gotta do, so many things we gotta change. And so guess what? We got 16 pages, okay? But yeah, understand, there are some changes. There are some new terms that have been added. There's some new forms. There's some contract forms that are gone away because you will be using an addendum to this agreement rather than a separate agreement. There'll no longer be a probate purchase agreement. You will use a probate addendum to this agreement. There's no longer a manufactured or mobile home contract. You use an addendum to this contract. And because it brings in mobile homes and they could be considered, some of them could be considered personal property, there's some tweaks made to this contract because it's dealing with real property and personal property, okay? So that's why you'll see some subtle changes that you might not, have realized before. But generally speaking, the concept of the contract hasn't changed dramatically. They reorganized things. They put all the contingencies in one place. They've rearranged things, moved it around, put it in what they think is a more logical, sequential order. The big change is paragraph 3, which you see on the bottom half of page 1, which is the beginning of what has been commonly referred to as the grid. Okay? That's what everyone's referring to. The bottom of page 1, all of page 2, and page 3. It's known as the grid. So basically, the way it works is that, and in a portion of page 4, all the filling out that you're going to do in this contract, for the most part, is going to be on pages 1, 2, 3, and the top half of 4. After that, everything that's in until you get to liquidated damages and binding arbitration and signatures. After that, it's just straight text paragraphs with explanations of what's in the grid. So the one thing I think you have to, as a practical matter, here's what you've got to be working on, is you've got to know what's in the explanation part ahead of time, so that if you're face to face with a buyer, either filling out an offer or explaining the offer, you've got to know what each one of those lines is talking about. Everyone follow me? Because otherwise, you're gonna be going, well, wait, we gotta flip over to page 6 or flip over here. So you've gotta understand these explanations, okay?
Steve, you talk so long the computer fell asleep. I need you to click the slide just every now and then.
Will do. So anyway, yeah, well okay, so I gotta remember I've got this here. So anyway, you see the bottom of the grid there, there's the next page, there's page 3, and then, see, you've got, at this point, you've got some addenda and advisories here. From there on, there's no blanks that you're filling in. It's all been done in the grid. Everyone follow me? You understand the concept here? I'm just trying to wrap your head around how this works. But again, I know the one thing that when I first looked at this, I thought this could get a little confusing in the beginning when you're explaining things to your client because you don't have any text there for each line. You've got to know what each one's talking about. Now, if they do have questions, then you're. But the nice thing is they got the paragraph number right there in the second column, and so you know right where to send them. You know, if you do have to answer questions. Here's the other part that I see as a practical matter, and that is, what are you going to do when you get done with the grid, and you're talking to the client? How much more dialogue are you going to have? The other question is, how much of this contract are they going to read after you've done with the grid? Just saying. You know, I think depending upon how well you know this and what kind of questions they have, I think you have to kind of be prepared for kind of like a two-part offer preparation. You understand where I'm coming from? In other words, you're going to walk them through the grid and fill all that stuff out, but then you may still have things you've got to talk about. There may be things that are unique to the property that you're buying that you need to have more specific discussions with, and it'll kind of come to light as we go through this. Did everyone understand what I'm saying? I'm just trying to. I haven't filled one out yet myself, so I'm just trying to. I'm just looking forward to the day when I've got to fill this out. How am I going to handle this with the client? Remember, it's one thing if the client is sitting in front of you. Okay, and I know that's foreign to a lot of you, but that's one way to do it. Okay, it's another if you've got the client on Zoom and you're going through it step by step, figuring out what to put. It's another for you to say, well, talk generally about what you think you want to put in there, and then, all right, well then I'll prepare it and I'll send it to you, and then you review it. I mean, that's kind of the three ways it plays out. So you got to be prepared for all three ways. Does that make sense?
Yes. So Steve, no changes on the PRDS side, even though CAR has gone through all these changes.
PRDS is a completely different animal.
They
They're totally independent. They're their own.
Yeah.
I think PRDS is eventually going to be on its way out because they've adopted so many Santa Clara County agents have adopted CAR. The big brokerages have. I think their shelf life is kind of like professional publishing. They were. I mean, when I started, we didn't use CAR. We used professional publishing. It was legal size paper. That was the contract we all used. But over time, CAR finally took over.
Makes sense.
Yeah. I'm actually a little surprised they're still around after all these years.
I'm now seeing mix and match.
Yeah,
Some people
right.
using
Yeah,
CAR.
exactly right. Exactly. Well, I think part of it is some of it has to do with a lot of the attorneys that are in San Jose that they use, and a lot of them, they're kind of advisors for that PRDS contract, and I think they kind of push it to a certain extent. Yeah.
Most listings today say CAR forms only.
Exactly. And
I haven't seen one yet that said
Yeah, I know.
PRDS.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah.
Years ago when I got in this business, if the listing was across the bay, it would so often use PDR.
Yeah.
And you know, they're
Yeah,
different,
yeah,
they're
yeah,
different
yeah.
animals
No,
to
it's
begin with.
exactly right, yeah.
But you rarely see that.
But yeah, but you still got, people that are, still behind the times, or still like to do it the old-fashioned way. Okay, so hopefully I give you kind of a little intro to what you may expect when it comes into filling one out. The other thing I'll share with you is, I'm pretty sure I still have a link to a soft copy. If you take the 4-hour $75 class, you get I think it's 120 pages,
Yeah.
okay,
Of explanation.
manual on the agreement. So for those of you that like to read and think you need, this is a very, very detailed manual that goes through this whole thing from front to back with pretty good explanation as to everything, the whys and the wherefores and so forth. All right, any questions before we start?
Is it in zip form? It goes under and-
No, I don't think it is.
No, I think
don't know.
that form is available for purchase. And
Yeah, it's probably available for purchase.
And it's not cheap.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, this is the manual that when you pay the 75, you get this manual. So like I said, I'm pretty sure I have a link to it, so we can, I'll double check, and Harshita, remind me tomorrow or whatever, to see if I can forward you the link to that, and then you can just send it out. All right, now we'll get started. Date prepared, no change, that's what's always been there. I know there's some of you, is anybody here that's not written an offer? So everyone's written at least one offer. Okay, that's good. Remember, on the date prepared, that is the date that you put there is a point of reference for referring back to that document when you're preparing subsequent documents after the offer. That date doesn't have any legal significance per se. Generally speaking, the date prepared will likely be the date that your buyer is signing the offer, but it could be earlier. And it's okay if it is, because it's just a date to refer back. Like if you're the seller's agent and you're doing a counter to the offer, you're referencing the date prepared. Once you have a purchase agreement, the date of your agreement is your date going forward when you're referencing your purchase agreement, okay? 1A, this is an offer from. This contract, understand that contracts, there's a lot of investors will ask you to write an offer, John Smith or Assanee, because they want to possibly assign the contract to someone else, okay? Don't use or Assanee, because this contract requires the seller to approve the assignment and approve the new assignee. So you can't assume there's going to be an assignee. Okay? So you don't use that in the top. You just put the buyer, and then there's a whole section with assignment and the process to go through getting an assignment approved and so forth. Okay, that's a separate part of this. So you need to explain that the contract's different now. We don't use or assignee. Yeah, I remember in law school, everyone laughed when it goes the asinore and the assignee, and everyone kind of giggled. He goes, but my real property professor was a hardcore professor. He goes, you may laugh, but that's how it's pronounced. If you want to sound like you know what you're talking about, it's an asinore and an assignee. That's the correct pronunciation. Okay. 1B, subtle change. It doesn't say the real property. It says the property, because the mobile home could be personal property. That's why they took out the word real there. Huge change. Notice they added a plural after assessor's parcel number, because you might have more than one parcel number that you're selling. Okay, so they added a line that made it a longer line and added the S so that you could put multiple APNs. The other provision there is that the postal/mailing address may be different from the city jurisdiction. Buyers advised to investigate. You'll find sometimes that when you go on a tax roll, that you may see a different address there than what the mailing address is on the mailbox. Okay, so you just need to be aware of that. At the end of the day, folks, the controlling number is the assessor's parcel number, which has a legal description attached to it. Okay, that's what's most important, and that's what you got to make sure is correct. You've heard me talk about, buyer's agent, the buyer bought the wrong condo, because that was just more of a mistake. The agent didn't realize which one they wanted versus the one they looked at two of them side by side, and he wrote the offer on the wrong one. A little different issue, but I mean, if they were really checking addresses, they might have caught it. Who knows? And the contract was much different back then. Okay, 1D, they want to remind the buyer and the seller that brokers and agents are not parties to this agreement. That appeared much later in the contract. They want it known right up front. Okay, paragraph 2 is agency. Now, the addition that they made here is clarifying something that a lot of people may or may not know, but the way our agency disclosure documents are set up now, you do not have to exchange agency disclosures. We used to have, the buyer's agent used to have to give one to the buyer and give one to the seller. It was a pain. There's no more exchange of agency disclosures, and that's what it says in the second sentence. Buyer's agent is not legally required to give the seller's agent the AD form signed by buyer, and seller's agent is not legally obligated to give the buyer's agent the AD form signed by seller. Now, I know what happens as a practical matter. When you prepare an offer, you get this package with about 6 forms in it, and you just send the whole link over. That's fine. But if you're the listing agent and the buyer's agent is asking for your AD, it's not required. You don't have to give it to them. And there are other forms that are like that while we're on the subject. There are several forms that are not meant to be, oops, I let it go out. There are several forms that are not meant to be exchanged. Anybody know some of those forms?
Privacy Act?
Buyer's inspection.
Buyer's inspection election is an in-house form. Buyer's inspection waiver is an in-house form. That's why it only has signature lines for the buyer. It's not meant to be given to the other side. It's like you're giving the enemy some paperwork to use against you later on. It's meant to memorialize our conversations with our own buyer as to which inspections they elect and which inspections they want to waive. So you gotta know when to put your foot down. There are some brokerages in town that ask for a ton of stuff that they're not entitled to, and the TCs know it. Because when I get my TC says they're asking for this, I said they're not going to get that, and that. And do I get any pushback? No, because they know they can't get them. Now you want all that stuff when you represent the buyer, but that's for our own files. Does everyone understand what I'm saying? You understand what I'm talking about? This isn't just a business, and TCs, I love them to death, but this isn't just a bunch of exchange of paperwork. Oh, I got all this stuff, I got to give it all to you. No, it doesn't work that way. There's some documents that we prepare that could be damaging to us if they got in the hands of the other side. Okay? The less they know about how we handle things with our buyer, the better. Back to the form. They've kind of tweaked the wording and so forth. You've got seller's brokerage firm. If you're the listing agent, that's Keller Williams Benchmark Properties. License number is 013455026. If we only represent the seller, you check the seller. If we represent both the buyer and seller, you check the box. We represent both the buyer and seller. That's what we call dual agency. Now, dual agency applies when you're the listing agent and you represent the buyer. And it applies when I'm the listing agent and one of you represents the buyer. We represent both parties, which means we can't share information to the other side without their consent. If I have a listing and you have a buyer interested in my listing, I can't tell you without seller's consent how much my seller's willing to take for the property. And you guys share that information all the time. I hear you outside my door. We have a fiduciary duty to our seller to get them the highest and best price possible. Your lips should be sealed. Unless you have seller's consent to disclose, you don't share it with anyone until escrow closes. Without seller's consent, you never disclose how much your seller, and you got to tell your seller the same thing. Don't go telling all your neighbors what you got for your property, because the word spreads. Then the deal falls through and now everybody knows what you took for the property. Not a good place to be if you're trying to get the highest and best price.
Yeah, that's much more significant in a different market than we're in now.
Yes and no, because in this market, if that property comes back on the market, it could possibly go for even more. If a buyer knows what you took, they know they know the ceiling they can target. If they have no idea, you don't know what they're going to offer. I mean, I had a $2 million listing with $1 million. I had $1.2 million offer on the table, and a guy comes in and he was ready to offer $2 million. He didn't even know that I had lowered the price to $1.8 million. He was ready to take $1.8 million. He was ready to offer $1.8 million. Do you think I would have got $1.8 million if I told him, oh, I've already got $1.2 million? He might go for $1.5 million, $1.6 million. He had no idea. It turned out he wasn't going to be able to buy the property because it wasn't going to qualify for financing. But that's a different issue. You understand where I'm coming with this? So, but understand, we have to be real careful when we represent both sides because we have a fiduciary duty to both parties. We can't reveal any confidential information to the other side without having their consent first. When we talk about it, the simple way is if you represent both sides, you can't tell the seller how much the buyer's willing to pay. And and when you're talking to the buyer, you can't tell them how much the seller's willing to accept. From a strict fiduciary duty standpoint, when someone asks you, how much will the seller take? The only thing you can really tell them honestly, without seller's consent, is, I know they'll take the list price. That's how you should answer the question, without seller's consent. All right, moving on. I knew this would digress into a normal contract class, without a habit. So everyone understand how to fill out the confirmation section. And then if you're going to have if you've got additional agents or additional brokers, then you can check a box. More than one brokerage represents seller or buyer. See additional broker acknowledgement, Form ABA. So it's got it for you right up front. You're able to establish that. We've had a few co-broker situations that I've seen come through. Moving on to paragraph 3, the grid. I like where they say this. They go this. The items in this paragraph are contractual terms of the agreement. Yeah, this isn't just these are the actual terms that you fill in. Okay, this isn't like a summary. This isn't a summary of what's to come in the offer. Okay, these are the actual terms in this grid. Reference paragraphs provide further explanation. This form is 16 pages. The parties are advised to read all 16 pages. Now, what I would submit to you is that, particularly with those of you that have been working with clients already, and you've written offers for them, and they're familiar with this contract, okay, and you're still working with them, that you go immediately after this class and you go pull up a sample copy. There's a sample copies of this are online. Okay. You go to CAR, you go to the upper left transaction center, click on that, and then I forget what it says after, you'll figure it out and you'll get to the forms. You can pull up, you can save a link to a saved sample copy of this agreement. Get that in their hands, because in 2 more weeks, if you go to write an offer, guess what, folks? Different form. Make sense? There's a reason to touch your client if you haven't talked to them in a couple weeks. All right, the grid. Paragraph A, purchase price. Pretty simple. Put in the price. If the offer is going to be all cash, you check the box for all cash. Next is close of escrow. It's going to be blank days after acceptance, or if you want to put a specific date, you put a specific date. Remember, don't do both. I always love when I get those. It's like, I ask Dave, when's escrow closing? And I wait for an answer. I go, well, that's not what your contract says. You got 2 different dates here. You're going to do one or the other. I mean, back in the day when we kind of knew we were probably going, there was a good likelihood we're going to close on the scheduled date. We'd all get hung up on whether we close on a Friday or a Monday, because we didn't want to close on a Monday because, you know, you fund the loan on the Friday and you pay interest over the weekend, and that's still the case. I mean, Monday closings are not a good closing for the buyer because they're paying extra. Remember, the interest charge starts on the loan the day the loan funds, not the day escrow closes. So if you fund the loan on Friday, you're paying interest on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. You're paying 3 days of interest rather than 1 day of interest if it was closing any other day. So it's not, you know, it's not to the buyer's benefit to close on Monday, unless you've got what we call a table funder lender where they could fund and you could sign and fund all in early enough in the morning to get electronic recordings have changed things. I had a closing where everything happened on one day. 7:30 sign off, 9:30 funding, 10:30 close. Had it happen. And that was a few years ago. That was before electronic recording. Okay, but everyone had their ducks in a row and was ready to go. But that's kind of hard to pull off. But electronic recording makes it possible, but you don't want to bank on that. My point is, when you write an offer and you say the proverbial 30 days after acceptance, if your negotiations get protracted, you don't know that date could get pushed out. And then all of a sudden, when you got acceptance, then you would count the numbers and go, oh shoot, closing is, you know, Monday's a holiday, we're closing on Tuesday. Now you even added another day. Because remember, generally speaking, your loan's got to fund the day before closing. Paragraph C, expiration of offer. Didn't change. The offer expires 3 calendar days after all buyer signatures. Or you can put a specific date at 5 p.m. or you can change the time to another time. Now, one of the benefits of, one of the reasons they did this grid and put everything together is that now, when you're looking at listing agents looking at an offer for the first time, they can see all the major stuff right up front. How many of you have forgotten to look at the expiration of the offer on a multiple offer situation when you got 10 offers and you're sitting there trying to go through them all, And then all of a sudden you go, wait a minute, I gotta go look back at page 10 to see if they threw a gotcha in there and want a response before, 3 days. And you gotta, you gotta look at that, and you gotta get a hold of the buyer's agent and say, hey, I'm not gonna be able to respond to, you only gave me 24 hours, I'm not gonna be able to respond in 24 hours. It's gonna take me 24 hours just to summarize all these offers and talk to the seller. So you need to negotiate an extension of that. And the way I memorialize that extension is I put it in my the first line of my counter offer. Buyer hereby agrees to extend seller's time to respond to buyer's offer to such and such day at such and such time. That's in the first line. So once I've got that agreement, that's how I memorialize it. Make sense?
So on that particular example, isn't the counteroffer actually resetting that time in any case?
No, if the offer is technically expired.
Right.
Okay? Your counteroffer does not resurrect the offer. Your counteroffer is that when you do a counteroffer, you are accepting that offer subject to your counteroffer. You have to have a viable offer. Now, it's not the end of the world. If you're the only player, if you're the only buyer, and the seller lets that time go and responds late, it's okay if the buyer says, we're fine that you're late. But remember, here's your challenge. If you're gonna counter the offer, then it's like, does it really matter? In a way, it doesn't really matter. Excuse me if I'm yelling, but I'm yelling because they need to hear me, okay? Because I feel like I'm yelling at you, okay? If you're gonna counter, you're not accepting their offer 100%. So does it really, and the private matter, does it matter that it's expired because you weren't trying to accept it outright? But the challenge is, what if they have an offer that you want to accept as written, and they were expecting a response in 24 hours, and you drug your feet till 3 days, and then you go, yeah, we want to accept your offer, and you go, oh, that's too late now. We found another property, we're over here. See where I'm going with it? Right. That's the risk you take by not protecting the seller's right to respond later. Because buyers are fickle, they could change their mind, another property could come on. That's your challenge. If you don't have that issue to worry about, yeah, you don't necessarily need to be worried about responding late. But I never know how it's going to play out.
And I know this is not a contracts class, but in that example, the last one that you said, if the buyer is still willing to accept,
Perfectly fine.
Even though it has expired, because I've had some of those
it's
situations.
Perfectly fine. Yeah, and all you have to do is just memorialize in an email, that buyer agreed. Did I lose it? What? Did I lose it again? Oh. Check device power. Someone know what to do? Know what to do, Alex? Yeah, I mean, all you got. It's kind of, I don't really worry about it too much. If the buyer goes ahead and accepts, and then I confirm receipt, send it back. It's like at that point we're acting as if there's a contract. Sure. Estoppel kicks in because once they send a deposit off, it's like, well, we're past that issue. Okay. As a practical matter, if you're the only, like I said, it's different when you're the only buyer versus in a multiple offer. I just made it a habit to not assume anything, protect my seller, and I had to do it on the last one. Someone wanted a response sooner than 3 days, and so I had to request an extension because I didn't know for sure yet which one they were going to go with. I'm just doing this to play with it. Okay. Everybody remind me to click on that. Okay. So does everybody understand what we're talking about? Am I losing anybody here? Hope not. Initial deposit amount, D1. You write in the deposit amount and then you put in the parentheses the percentage of the purchase price so that the listing agent can see, did you do 3% or did you do some other number? Now, it goes on to say the percentage number above is for calculation purposes and is not a contractual term. The dollar amount is the controlling number. If they do the math wrong, that doesn't change the deposit amount. The deposit amount is the dollar amount written in. Kind of the opposite of checks. Because what controls with checks? The handwritten number controls, not the written number. Right, John?
Yes.
Yes.
We probably don't know
He used
yet.
to be my banker, okay?
We probably don't know yet, but I bet it will compute the percentage.
It didn't sound, to me, it didn't sound like it did.
It
In the
should.
class, in the class I was in, it didn't sound like it
People
did.
doing
Yeah.
their math is terrible.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like you could put 3% in there, and then the dollar amount would be lower, and if somebody doesn't pay attention, they took a lower dollar amount.
That's
Yeah,
why I'm
right.
saying it should compute it.
Yeah.
Well, but that's why they say the percentage part doesn't control, it's the dollar
I know,
amount that
but it's
controls.
for
Yeah.
our information.
Yeah, I don't know. I got the impression
Another
from
thing
the
to look
class,
at
I
every
got the
time.
impression from Gov that it doesn't. That's why they put that in there. They would, if it did that, they wouldn't need that, because it would come out right.
Well,
That-
but
that seems
we
like a
need to-
change,
We
though,
want the
from-
knowledge.
Yeah, I understand that, but I'm just saying,
I guess when
That's
you
all.
fill one out, you'll find out.
yeah. And then, additional terms, it's within 3 business days after acceptance, and now the default is, there's no other options to even check unless you check other. Wire transfer is the assumed means of transferring deposit. If you want to do something other than a wire, then you've got to check the OR box and then write in what method. Because word on the street is there are some title companies or escrow holders that aren't accepting checks.
Yeah.
They don't want checks anymore. Now, the other thing too, and I don't know if you picked up on what I said there, for those of you that are newer in the business, this contract is drafted for use in the entire state of California. In Northern California, our title company is the escrow holder. They serve both capacities. In Southern California, they have separate escrow companies and title insurance companies. So that's why you see the reference to escrow holder has significance here, because it's referring to a different company than the title insurance company. And in fact, there's one section here where when we get to it, I'll point it out to you. It's talking about something that we don't do in Northern California. Talking about escrow instructions being signed up front within so many days. We don't do that up here. We don't generate escrow instructions until we get to the sign-off, okay?
Well, we actually do.
No, but
We
the other,
submit
the,
this.
yeah, no,
These are escrow
we're talking about,
instructions.
no, we're talking about their escrow
I know what
instructions.
you're
Yeah,
saying.
not this, their escrow instructions. Okay, D2 is talking about the increased deposit. Remember, you can have a situation where maybe the buyer doesn't have 3% right now. And I'm making an assumption you understand when I say 3%. We recommend 3% because under the liquidated damages clause, if the property is a 1 to 4 unit property and it's owner occupied, the buyer's going to owner occupy the property, the maximum that can be retained by the seller as liquidated damages is 3% of the purchase price. So that's why we want to see a 3% deposit, okay? Now, sometimes you may have a buyer that doesn't, first-time buyer doesn't have all their cash. Maybe they're getting part of their down payment as a gift. Maybe they're going FHA, 3.5% down. Maybe they're going VA, 0 down. They don't have a lot of money right now at the time you're writing the offer. So you may want to say initial deposit's 1%, and then they'll increase it. That other 2% will come later. And they may, the default here for increased deposit is that increased deposit doesn't occur until all contingencies have been removed. Which, when you think about it as a practical matter, until all the contingencies are removed, the deposit's not at risk
There's no need
until all those changes have been removed. So it doesn't really matter how much deposit is up front, absent the buyer acting in bad faith. Because remember, we have an implied covenant of good faith and fair dealing, and you can prove, if you can prove bad faith, regardless of the status of contingencies, you could still pursue the deposit. Absent that issue, you can take the position that doesn't really matter how much is there initially, because they can't get to it anyway. But once all contingency is removed, now it's totally at risk. Again, absent bad faith on the part of the seller. Everyone understand that? Now, money placed into escrow after the initial the increased deposit is money placed into escrow after the initial deposit. And in the old days, we used form RID, receipt for increased deposit. The form has been renamed to DID for delivery of increased deposit and liquidated damages addendum. When you complete an offer and you have an initial deposit and both parties' initial liquidated damages, the liquidated damages only applies to the initial deposit. If there's going to be a subsequent deposit, if there's going to be an increased deposit, there needs to be a new liquidated damages clause as to the increased deposit. That's why we have form now DID. Don't ever forget to do that form when you have an increased deposit. We had an agent that ended up having to write a check to a seller for $16,000 for failing to generate, at that time, the RID form.
Do you know if checking the increased deposit box causes the DID form to populate?
I believe it does. I believe it does. Yeah, as I understand it, that every form that most or not all of the forms that are referenced here are auto-populate when you check the boxes for them. That's my understanding.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Okay. We don't see increased deposit a lot, but when you do it, just gotta make sure you do it right. Okay. All right, loan amount. E1. You put in the dollar amount for the first loan. You put in the percentage of the purchase price. The buyer's putting 20% down, then the loan amount's going to be 80%. It defaults to fixed rate. If it's going to be an adjustable rate, then you check a box and you put the initial adjustable rate not to exceed percentage. Now, the way they did this, it's kind of, the not to exceed percentage applies to both the fixed rate and the initial adjustable rate. They didn't really draft this as well as they could. Generally speaking, I recommend bumping up the rate by anywhere from 0.5 to 3/4%, maybe up to the nearest whole number, depending on where rates are. If rates are in the low 3s, I'd have it at 4. Okay, doesn't mean that's what the buyer's going to get, but they're going to pursue a loan in good faith up to that rate, because rates change daily. Then it defaults to buyer paying 0 points, or if they're going to pay points, then you could put a percentage of the loan amount if they're going to pay, say, up to 1% of the loan amount. See, at one time in our business, 1.5 points was the norm. That was what, but things have changed, and now 0 points is the norm. Remember, when we talk about points, we're talking about a percentage of the loan amount. And so that's where, and then it defaults, when you go to additional terms, it defaults to a conventional loan. So again, so if you got a conventional loan, it defaults to a conventional loan with a fixed rate at 0 points. That's all pre-done. Now, if you're going FHA, you check FHA. If you're going VA, you check VA. If you go FHA or VA, then the forms FVAC and HID are going to populate. Who knows what those forms are? Besides Jerry and John, no. The FVAC is what's called your FHA VA amendatory clause relative to the appraisal. The amendatory clause says that regardless of whether there's an appraisal contingency or not, an FHA or VA deal, you guys weren't looking at it anyway. Oh, no, it came back. All right.
Hasn't changed.
I know. Gov spent 2 hours on the grid, so I'm not behind yet.
Have you seen a Cal bet loan?
Calvet, no, not in years.
Yeah.
I started to do one maybe 25 years ago, and
Wow.
we didn't, yeah.
I just wonder if they're still doing them.
Yeah, I think they're still out there, they just don't get a lot of, I think they're still there.
I did one on a mobile home in a mobile home park once.
Yeah.
I did one about, I'm gonna say 3 or 4 years ago, I had a listing.
Was it 5% down? I think it was 5, right? 5% down, at least the last time. The VA's 0, but I think the Calvet was 5%
Oh,
down.
Calvet, okay.
Calvet's 5%,
No,
yeah.
Calvet,
Yeah,
They,
yeah.
they
See, back
buy
in.
the property and sell it back to you on a contract of sale.
Right, yeah. Yeah, that Calvet, after World War II, tons of houses were purchased with Calvet loans. My
It's
parents,
a great loan.
everybody in my parents' neighborhood, they're all Calvet, and I did trust for everybody, it was all Calvet loans. They were all.
Passé.
The HID is the document that recommends home inspection to the borrower, okay? If there's seller financing, you check a box, there's a whole other seller financing addendum, a 3-page document. I could teach a class on that, but we don't do it much. So if you ever have that, you know. Seller financing could be helpful in when rates are rising, rates are high, having trouble selling a property, seller owns a property seller owns it outright. The other more likely situation is that for capital gains tax purposes, the seller doesn't want to do a 1031 exchange if it's an investment property, doesn't want to take the hit now, wants to spread their gain out over the time of the loan. Okay, so that's one reason why seller financing is done. Now, if you go in FHA or VA, then there's a 17-day time period for providing a lender list of required repairs. Now, that's always been in the contract, for those of you who've done an FHA or VA. And I just make sure you understand, VA is, you got a veteran, they have what's called their DD 214, which is their certificate of eligibility. They can get a VA loan with zero down. And you can even have the seller pay all of their closing costs. They can literally move into a property with 0 out of pocket. Perfectly fine. Now, VA loans require a Section 1 pest control certification and a roof certification. The way CAR has got things set up, you wait for the lender to tell you what's required, and then you negotiate it within 17 days after acceptance. I submit to you, if you're doing a VA loan, you already know it needs Section 1 and a roof, so you negotiate those right up front with your offer, okay? The way they have it, it comes up, you give it, there's a list, and there you can use a repair request and so forth. Now, that negotiation occurs within 17 days after acceptance. Before I forget, we're going to take a break at 2 o'clock, okay? Maybe about 10 minutes, but I'm going to have to pick it up here. E2 is dealing with a second loan, an additional finance amount, if there's going to be a second. If some of you ever heard the term 80-10-10, that's where you got a buyer that doesn't. Remember, you're going to get better financing with 20% down because there's no mortgage insurance. Well, if you have a buyer with at least 10% down, instead of getting a 90% loan with mortgage insurance or a loan that's self-insured with a higher rate, sometimes it's advantageous to do an 80-10-10 where you put 10% down, you get an 80% first and a 10% second. And when you do the numbers, the blended payment is better that way than it is with mortgage insurance. Now, I've done different scenarios where it didn't always work out. I've seen some 90s. I've seen some 90s with no PMI better than the 80-10-10. So you get with a loan officer and discuss those options. But that's where you're likely going to. When rates were really high, we were doing 80-10-10s all day long. And at that time, it was a different lender. And they were table funding. The checks were coming over with the loan docs. Here's your 10%. And it's like, I didn't even sign. Oh, here's the money. But it went straight to the title company. Same scenario as far as checking. Now you could have a seller carry 10% too. It's another way to bridge that gap. You could do 80-10-10, and buyer puts down 10%, seller carries 10%, and buyer gets an 80% loan from the conventional lender. Now remember, it's not in the old days, everyone used to try to do what's called a silent second. Can't be a silent second. It's in the contract, the lender's aware. The payment on the second's included in their PITI for determining their debt-to-income ratio. E3, occupancy type defaults to primary. If it's a secondary home or an investment, then you check the boxes. Obviously, there's significance to the different occupancies from a loan standpoint, because the rates are going to be different on the secondary or investment. And also the whether liquidated damages, the 3% limit applies on liquidated damages, depends on whether it's primary owner occupied versus investment property. Balance of down payment, I'm going to assume that it auto-populates that as it does in the old, but haven't done it yet. Pat said she did a sample agreement, but I don't think she was doing it online. I don't think there's a way to, I don't think we have a live form to fill in yet. That'll come on the 14th. And then purchase price to show the total. An hour in for one page, not bad. Any questions? Still on the grid, G1, we now have a clause pre-printed to provide for a seller credit. So now you don't have to write it in. It's now in the contract. Actually, I don't have a lot of notes here. I can look at this. So you've got seller credit. So if there's going to be a seller credit, you check the box. You put in the dollar amount. You can put in the percentage of purchase price. Why would you want the percentage of purchase price? Because some lenders have limits on the amount of the credit based on the amount of the loan and the loan to value. Some lenders will say up to this amount you could go, it could be 3%, and under this amount, up to this amount, your credit could be 6%. There's limits on credits, but remember, in 99.999% of the times, the credit cannot exceed actual closing costs. Because if you allow the seller to credit the buyer more than their actual closing costs, you're putting part of the buyer's down payment into their pocket, right? That's why the lender won't. Think about it. You know how easy it would be to sell property if there was no limit on credits? I could sell a property to every person that walks down the street if there was no limit on credits. Think about it. It'd be easy. So the first thing you do, here's the thing, you guys, the credit is your Band-Aid to fix a problem. I understand that. An issue comes up, dealing with an inspection, the condition of the property, and you want to fix it. And no one wants to do the repair, so the only way to fix it is to negotiate a credit. And there's nothing wrong with that. Now when you're negotiating a credit, after the fact, it's not here, it's going to end up on an addendum. I'm just giving you generally how you generally come up with credit. When it comes to writing an offer asking for a credit, generally speaking, particularly in the market we have now, if you're requesting a credit, it's because your buyer really needs it. They don't have enough cash to cover the down payment and the closing cost. I mean, folks, what's the biggest issue we have right now in California? Starts with an A. Affordability. People, the average person isn't making enough money to save a 20% down payment, much less a 10% down payment with the amount that where rents are. So that means we have a lot of people that would love to buy, but then they may have the income, but they don't have the down payment and closing costs. So it's not a foreign matter to have someone possibly need help with closing costs. But if I'm the listing agent on the seller side, and I've got a bunch of offers, and I see this credit, well, my first question is, do they need it? Are they negotiating, or do they need it? Make sense? That's the first thing I look at their offer, I look at their verification of funds, I see how much cash they have. I know that it's gonna take, just for those of you that are new, just assume it's gonna generally take depending on seller's property tax, it's gonna take, depending on purchase price, it could take anywhere from 1 to 1.5% of the purchase price in closing costs, assuming a 0 points loan. Play it safe, call it 2%. It'd be on the high side. See, the variable is property taxes. Property tax prorations can change it, and obviously city transfer tax can change it dramatically too. But assuming no city transfer tax, again, you know, 1.5% is you're gonna be in the ballpark. And I'm assuming no impound account, because impound is gonna change the whole calculation too, which comes into effect in the FHA VA loan, which is where you have the buyers that don't have a lot of cash. Do you everyone understand where I'm going with this? I'm just trying, I want you to wrap your head around this concept. But as a listing agent, when I see a credit, I go, why are they asking for credit? Do they need it? Now, here's another thing though. Let's say you got a great house, but the roof's ready for replacement. The roof is shot. The roof has to be replaced, and it's going to cost $15,000 to replace the roof. And the buyer's putting everything they have into that house to buy it, but once they move in, they don't have any money to replace the roof. Ask for a $15,000 credit. What are they doing? If they're putting 20% down, they're putting $3,000 down, and they're borrowing $12,000 more to give them the 15 credit to pay for the roof after close. You understand that concept? Remember, that credit is cash from the seller. It comes off, and make sure your sellers understand when you're negotiating credit that that's coming off of their purchase price. Sometimes people sometimes they think that credit's coming from some third party. No, it's coming out of your pocket. Make sure they understand that. All right, enough on credits. Additional finance terms, if you've got anything else you want to put in there, there's really, even the book kind of struggles with what to put in there. There's really, you might have maybe you might be some kind of special loan program or something that needs some participation from the seller to sign forms or whatever. Again, I mean, the question I always used to get was, where do I put the credit? Is it a finance term or is it an additional term? So it's technically an additional term. It's not a finance term, it's an additional term. Well, now it's got its own line item here. All right, moving on to H1, 2, and 3, those are your verifications. If it's an all-cash offer, verification sufficient funds to pay cash, verification down at closing, verification of loan application. The contract assumes they're all attached. Remember, it's now the reverse of what our current contract says, right? Because our current contract says you can do it within 3 days, and if you got it attached, you got to check boxes. And now you don't check boxes. It assumes, defaults to, you're providing them all right up front. So you're going to provide your verification of funds in your pre-approval letter, your verification loan application, and you're going to state, if there's a loan, you're going to state, is it a pre-qualification letter, is it a pre-approval letter, or is it a fully underwritten pre-approval? So now it's got 3 options. Moving on to J, final verification condition. That's 5 days prior to close. One thing I wanted to mention. See here where it says calendar days? That's the only place in the contract where it uses the word calendar. And see here where it says business? That's the only place in the contract where it uses the word business days. After that, they just want to make it sure it's clear that on expiration of offers it's 3 calendar days, and they want to make sure it's clear that on the deposit it's business days. After that, days, which is calendar days, and then we'll talk about calculation of that. There's a really long paragraph that shows you how to calculate that.
How many fingers do you have?
I only have 9, yeah. Okay, final verification, 5 days prior to close. That's same as before. Assignment request. Remember I mentioned earlier, the request for an assignment must be made within 17 days after acceptance. Now, understand, adding a spouse, adding a guarantor is technically an assignment. So what this contract says is if you're contemplating adding a spouse after the fact, you've got to make that request within 17 days after acceptance. And if you foresee that being done, but it's not going to, you're not going to decide to do it until later, you need to put a longer time period in here. Okay? Make sense? Okay, now we got the contingencies. There's a potential of, all the contingencies are together, there's a potential of up to 8 contingencies in the contract. And now they're all in one place instead of spread out in different, in three or four, actually 4 different places. Now, if all transactions are going to could have 4 contingencies: appraisal, investigation, review of seller documents, and preliminary title report. L2, was it L? Yeah. Yeah, L2, 3, 4, and 5. Remember, even in a cash offer, the buyer can get an appraisal contingency if they want, can have the property appraised if they want. Now, if there's a loan, then you're going to have the 5th contingency is going to be the loan. If there's an HOA, you're going to have contingency number 6, which is common interest disclosures, the HOA documents. If there are any leased or liened items, typically a solar system. So there's either a solar system with a lease, or if it was financed, it's got either a PACE or a HERO loan. That's another contingency. That's contingency's already in the contract. Same thing, but the wording's different. We'll get to that. And contingency number 8, if the buyer is making an offer contingent on the sale of the property they currently own, that's another contingency. So you've got the potential of 8. On a finance deal, remember, you're gonna start out with a potential of 5, but you may decide not to have a loan contingency. You may decide not to have an appraisal contingency. And then they remind you that removal of appraisal contingency does not eliminate appraisal cancellation rights in the FDAC. We know all about that, don't we, Ping? Don't we, Ping, about the cancellation and the FHA?
Yes.
Right. You awake?
Yes.
Okay.
I am.
Okay. Okay. She's got a transaction where we've got an issue with, there was an underlying issue where that was involved. All right. So loan. Now the other thing I got to point out, what's different here than the old contract is, look at the default time frame. They're all 17. What's the loan in the original? What's the loan in our current form? What's the default in the current form? 21 is the current default there. What's the default on the appraisal? What is it? 17. What's default on investigation, review of seller documents, preliminary title report, common interest? What's the default on all these in the current contract? 17. So the only one they really changed was loan to 17. But what that means is if you're going to have a loan contingency, you got to talk to your loan officer and say, how much time do you need for the loan contingency? I mean, I've got guys that, folks, it all comes down to how complete of a package the buyer gives the loan officer up front. You've got a buyer that's got a great record keeper and has all that stuff online and can submit them a complete package right on day 1. They can get you an approval in 14 to 15 days. But if they don't get it all and they need more, typically most guys are going to tell you, oh, we probably need 25 days. Depends on whether they want to put a fudge factor in there. 21, some can do 21. They're all over the board. It depends on who they are and who their processors and whether they got their act together or not. That's why you gotta ask. Yeah, well, a lot of these guys just, they take apps and then set them aside and just keep taking apps and promising the world, and then they don't even get to it for 4 or 5 days. They don't even know when escrow is supposed to close. They don't look at the counteroffer in the back. They go off the date on the page 1. Well, that's not the close date. We changed the close date. Oh, I didn't know that. Read what you're given.
I mean, in that sense, I think H3, I don't remember seeing a fully underwritten pre-approval.
No.
That's a new question.
That's new. That's a new option, yeah.
For the lending officer to.
Right, the current contract says pre-qual or pre-approval. It doesn't have fully underwritten pre-approval.
So that's a new question
That
to
is new,
keep in
yeah.
mind.
That's a new one, yeah. And that's gonna make your offer look better.
Yeah.
If that's what you've got.
Yeah.
Fully underwritten is almost as good as cash except for the appraisal.
Yeah. So you've got, you've got everything 17, and you've got to decide if you're going to have a loan, you may want to tweak that. Appraisal, you could potentially shorten that. Appraisals were kind of backed up there for a while, but it's not quite as bad now. I mean, typically you can usually get an appraisal within 7 to 10 days, depending on who's doing what and how soon they're on it when they got a contract. I mean, sometimes I get calls from appraisers on day 3 or 4. Other times it takes 7, 8 days, and they go, haven't heard yet. L3, this contains 2 time frames. An investigation of property, and then the informational access to property. But this is not a contingency, but they put that in there because it was hidden before in another place. So they want you to know that even if you write a non-contingent offer with no investigation contingency, the buyer still has, by default, 17 days to access the property to conduct inspections. Until that was added to, and that's in the current contract now, until that was added, the buyer had no right to inspect the property or access the property once their investigation contingency was removed. They were done. You don't get to go back. That was what the old contract said. But our new one doesn't say that now. And this is consistent with it. But it's all in the same place. So because you need to make sure your buyer understands, if you decide to remove the investigation contingency, you still have this in place. This is not a contingency. This doesn't get removed by removing contingency, because it tells you buyer's right to access property for information purposes only is not a contingency. It does not create additional cancellation rights for buyer. It's not a contingency when you remove all contingencies, but it doesn't create a cancellation. It doesn't create a cancellation right either. Now, as far as removal, you check the box for no loan. You can check the box for no appraisal. For the removal of all these other contingencies, you use the contingency removal form. Now, you do not need to put, if you're going to remove all contingencies, you don't need to put 0 in here. You use the contingency removal form, and that's attached to the offer. Now, if you put 0 in there, that's going to suggest to the seller that you're doing that. But it's not a technical requirement, because there's not going to be, this doesn't apply when you remove the contingencies.
Have you seen the new contingency removal form?
I haven't looked at it, no.
I'm just wondering if it covers all, it must cover all the.
Oh, yeah, no, they're all in there, yeah. Yeah, they're in the, they're,
Common interest
yeah.
is.
Yeah, no, they're-
you know, that's corporate owned and,
well, no, common interest disclosure is your HOA documents.
yeah.
If you have an HOA, that's what common interest disclosure is talking about. Now, remember, we've got on review of seller documents is that's a new phrase. It's talking about disclosures. Review of seller documents here. The seller documents are referring to generally speaking, they're all the documents the seller's supposed to provide within 7 days after acceptance, but, they include all the disclosure documents and so forth, okay? They just changed the wording there. But remember, on each one of these, they all have a provision that it's X days after acceptance or 5 days after receipt, whichever is later, if you get them late. Remember, if you have a contingency, say HOA docs are the best example. Let's say you maintain your HOA contingency, and if you don't get your HOA docs until, you leave it at 17 and you don't get your HOA docs until day 15, you have till day 20 to remove the contingency or cancel the contract. You get 5 days from receipt. Review of leased or lien items, again, we're talking about the solar system. We'll talk about that more in detail when we get to the explanation of that. Yeah, this is, review of seller documents is your disclosures, your inspection reports, NHD report, all the things you normally see in a pre-disclosure package.
So Steve, if you don't do investigation, you're gonna send the CR form and you don't need to put 0?
You don't, no,
Okay.
zero's not needed.
Only the CR.
You don't need it,
Okay.
yeah. As long as you check this box and you attach or remove,
Yeah.
you've removed the contingency. See, by removing the contingency, whichever ones you removed, this doesn't apply anymore. It does tip off the listing agent, but it's not necessary.
So Steve, a little bit of confusion, I guess. When you check the box there, CR attached, that simply means the form's attached. That
Yeah.
doesn't release everything. You
You've
still
got-
gotta go into the form.
You
and
gotta,
do your
well, yeah,
release.
you've gotta go in and fill out the
Right.
form, yeah, because you may pick and choose.
Right.
Yeah, you may pick and choose versus, says, any contingency in L 1-7 may be removed or away by checking the applicable box above or attaching a contingency removal form and checking the applicable box therein. Removal or waiver at time of offer is against agent advice. We always tell them, gotta protect ourselves, see paragraph 8H. Okay? Moving on to M, time of possession. Defaults to, this is new, upon notice of recordation is the default. So as soon as you get that email or that call, get the big on record exclamation point,
It's transferred.
then it's time, you can let the buyer have keys because they officially own the property. But not until then. Don't ever let an agent or a buyer get keys to a property before escrow closes, or you have confirmation of recording. And there are agents out there that'll still ask for that. Oh, I'm in their area right now, can I go get the key? No. Can't have it. Yes.
So I think in the current form, we used to have the removal of contingency as a separate.
Well, it was
And when we
it was in 14, it was at the end of 14.
And when we
But
checked
see,
it.
but you see, loan and appraisal were in pages 1 and 2. All your other contingencies were in 14B1, and then contingency removal was at the end of 14.
Right.
So
But
now
when
they're,
we checked that it removed, now it's slightly different implication.
well, you still have to do the same thing with the new contract. You have to check boxes. That checking the box doesn't remove contingency. You have to do the form.
The form, yeah.
You still have to do the
But-
form.
But it used to open up that form.
Yeah, and I'm pretty
by-
sure that I think this form comes up, when you click on that, I'm pretty sure it populates. It's my understanding it does. Now, an alternative to recordation, you could check 6 PM, which our current contract has, or another time on the date specified as applicable in 3M2. What's 3M2? Where is it? What are they doing here? Wait a minute. Oh, wait, I'm sorry. 3M2 is
The seller
the tenant occupied addendum, yeah. Yeah. Okay, then, moving on, so you've got, that's a little change there, recordation rather than 6 PM, or some other time. I would, my recommendation would be recordation or 6 PM. I wouldn't do it earlier, 'cause you never know when you're gonna get confirmation recording. On M2, on seller occupied or vacant units, they're talking about possession here is talking about when there's a rent back. here. That's what they're talking about. Or there's a tenant, either they're talking about 3M2 is this, rent back, or TOPA is tenant occupied property addendum. So for seller occupied or vacant unit, it's going to be the close of escrow date, or if checked, it's going to be so many days after close. If it's 29 or fewer, you check here. If it's 30 or more, you check here. If it's 29 or fewer, you use form SIP, and that form will populate. If it's 30 or more, you use the RLAS that's attached to 30 days or more. The significance of that has to do with landlord-tenant laws and how laws apply to the seller. If a seller is in the property for less than 30 days, we grant them what's called a license to be in possession of the property. Once they're there for 30 days, they now become a tenant under landlord-tenant law. That's why we have a different form. And that's why there's that distinction. And our agents still want to do an SIP for 30 because they want 1 page. They don't want 5 pages. It doesn't. You're creating problems. Okay. If you want the proverbial 30-day rent back, you need to make it a 29-day rent back, not a 30. Yeah.
So hypothetically, say you come to an agreement and it's a 30-day rent back. Would you be able to legally do a 29-day rent back once that's coming to close, draft up an addendum for an extra day?
You'd be creating a 30-day situation. Okay. You can't. Yeah. The law's going to see them as a tenant for being in there 30 days, and it can create. See, it creates problems if they don't move out. And there's actually a new thing in here when it comes to sellers not removing all their property that's kind of cool. We'll get to.
So one last question regarding
Yeah.
that. So say you do come to an agreement and it's 29 days, and you're coming up to the 27th, 28th day. Things hit the fan, and the sellers need to stay in the property for a little longer.
You need to do the RLAS. Yeah, you need to convert to the RLAS because and there's some differences in there when it comes to. There's a little difference when it comes to maintenance of the property and who's responsible for what. They're not exactly the same, and we've had issues sometimes on dealing when something breaks down during the rent back, and it depends on which form's used as to how it's resolved. If you got a tenant occupied unit, you check a box, and now use the tenant occupied property addendum. Basically, the way it's set up. No, not that one. Where'd it go? I had it here. I guess I didn't bring it. The way it's set up is that it states that the property that the tenant will either remain in the property, under say a current lease agreement or month-to-month rental agreement, or it'll be vacant. But it has a provision in there that if within, I think it's within like if within so many days prior to close, if the tenant is not going to be out, the buyer has the right to cancel the contract. So that's how it's set up.
Which contract?
The purchase agreement.
But they're already in it, it's closed escrow at that point.
No, tenant moving out prior to close.
Tenant.
Talking about the tenant not moving out
Tenant in
prior.
possession.
Yeah, tenant not moving out prior to close. So it's basically, if you've got a tenant that's not moving out, your buyer has 2 choices. Cancel the contract or assume that tenant and then deal with that tenant later, okay?
Not good options.
Yeah. Moving on. Documents fees. So we've got seller delivery of documents, same as before, 7 days after acceptance, and that paragraph 14A lists all the documents the seller's supposed to provide within 7 days. Sign, return, escrow holder, general provisions. This is the one I was talking about. That's a Southern California thing. So that in our world, that N2 is not going to apply because it's talking 5 days after receipt. See, we don't get the title company. We give the contract, and the contract is escrow instructions, but the title company has their own escrow instructions and general provisions. We don't get those until the sign off at the close. When you open an escrow in Southern California, you get escrow holder general provisions and supplemental instructions up front. And you're be given them within 5 days after receipt. We don't do that up here. Have you ever had an escrow officer call you a couple days after acceptance asking for terms? I have. You know why? Because that escrow officer's in Southern California. And that's how they do it. We don't do that here. We wait and confirm terms when after the loan docs show up, and then they create their own escrow instructions and general provisions and fill everything out, and then but we still have an escrow open because we gave them this. This opens our escrow. In the old days, we didn't have open escrows. We had escrow orders, and deposits would go to the title company, but guess what? There was no escrow. All there was an escrow order, which meant the buyer could have walked in any day they wanted and said, give me my deposit back. There's nothing the seller could do because there was no escrow yet.
And that has happened.
Yeah, but now by giving this contract to the title company, we have an open escrow. A little history there for you. And 3, time to pay fees for ordering HOA docs. So this now has in the old contract, what's it say? Seller's supposed to order the HOA docs within 3 days after acceptance. Now it's pay for them within 3 days after acceptance. Now, as a practical matter, given current market conditions, I'd say many of us are ordering the HOA packages up front and making it part of our disclosure package. Yeah, now you do have to worry about timing and how long is it going to take from the time you receive them until you get an offer, until you close, and might there be some new meeting minutes that, there's a little bit of oversight as to whether or not there might be anything changing depending on how much time passes. But as a general, I still think I've been doing on every HOA I have now, I'm ordering them right up front, and it's all part of my package. Okay? It's just better to give the buyer as much information as possible. And then we'll talk about, there's the other issue with pre-disclosure packages in the 3 or 5 day right of rescission that attaches to five groups of disclosure documents that we'll talk about.
So Steve, is this assumed to be sort of seller, because in the current contract it is seller, buyer, they have options. Here it doesn't say it.
This just says pay them. So we haven't got to the part where we check who pays. This is just the time frame.
Even though the norm has been the
No,
seller
that
pays
says who
it.
pays them.
Yeah.
That paragraph does.
No, this just says time to pay. Oh,
No, but
the next.
if you read the paragraph,
Yeah, I know, we haven't got there yet.
it
Yeah.
says the seller shall pay for.
No, I think,
No,
I just read it.
yeah, it doesn't say that here.
let's see here. Does this one have the defaults to that?
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
on the next page.
on preparing disclosures, yeah, it has seller default.
Q12 says.
Yeah. Yeah,
Q12
yeah,
says-
is default, yeah. I was just trying to distinguish that this itself just talks about the time frame, but the actual paragraph covers your question about who pays, yeah. It still remains the seller, yeah. And then this another change is the installation of smoke alarms, carbon monoxide detectors, and water heater bracing. That has to occur within 7 days after acceptance. Now that's a big change. The only thing right now that was triggering that it be done as soon as possible was you wanted it done before the appraiser gets there, and that's why it's there now.
Click, click, read.
Yeah. You want it because you want all the appraisers are looking for all that now, so that's why they put that in there. And then there's a provision that talks about if a seller is supposed to do it and fails to pay for it, then the seller, any reinspection fee for the appraiser coming back is all on the seller because they failed to meet that time frame. Okay? Moving, now here's another big change on the grid, to page 3, having to do with items that are included and excluded. Now you can see you got a lot more choices here. And part of this is to try to eliminate a lot of issues that have been coming up over what's a refrigerator. A lot of sellers have been taking wine coolers because they think they're not refrigerators. So that's why they now have a box for the wine refrigerator to distinguish between a regular refrigerator and a wine refrigerator. Oh yeah, that happens, has been happening a lot. So now you've got stove oven combos, refrigerators, wine refrigerators, washers, dryers, dishwashers, microwaves.
So I can't take the wine cooler. I just leave the wine refrigerator.
Yeah, right. Well, if you've got both, yeah. Video doorbell, security camera equipment, security systems, alarms other than separate video doorbell and camera equipment, smart home control devices, and there's expanded paragraphs on all this. Smart home control devices, wall-mounted brackets for video or audio equipment. This is a change in the contract. When there's a flat screen TV and a bracket, guess what's excluded? Both the TV and the bracket. It defaults to removing the bracket and patching the holes but not painting. Where, remember before, you checked the box to take the bracket. Before, under the current contract, the bracket stays unless you check the box. Now the bracket by default goes. Or no, I'm sorry, that's, wait a minute, why did they do, oh, that's why they put that in there, because that's what the default is in the contract. You've got to check that box as a buyer, you've got to check that box if you want the bracket to stay, okay? Because under the contract it goes. If you got an above ground pool or spa, bathroom mirrors unless excluded below, and bathroom mirrors are a big problem, and they automatically have the box checked because they assume buyers want the bathroom mirrors. But you'd be surprised how many calls I get for bathroom mirrors.
We've had staging problems in that regard.
Yeah.
The mirror's a piece of crap, and the stager takes the mirror out and puts their own mirror in, and you gotta fight over whose mirror it is.
Exactly, yeah, there you go. Electric car charging systems and stations. Yeah, I sold a house with a Tesla charger in the garage because my seller was moving to a loft in San Francisco and had no place to install the charger, so it was a bonus in the house. I don't know if the buyer ever bought a Tesla or not, but he had a $3,000 charger in his garage. And then potted trees or shrubs, you can check a box for potted trees and shrubs because they're not in-ground landscaping. But I would still, I'd caution you to identify them even more specifically, especially if there's a lot of them. Now, if you're gonna, any items that be excluded, you put them down here. Now.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
You're saying now this contract says that the wall brackets
Yeah.
don't stay,
Now.
even though they're permanently attached to the wall.
Yeah, it now says if you go to page 6, 9C, it says brackets attached to walls, floors, or ceilings for any such component, furniture item will be removed, and holes or other damage shall be repaired but not painted.
So this is a change from the old.
It's 180 degrees of the current contract says you gotta check the box,
Right.
the brackets stay. This defaults to no bracket.
Right.
Now here, folks, here's what I do as a listing agent. When I'm walking around a house and I see, multiple flat screen TVs, and I know I've got, on the old contract, this was TVs and brackets and whatnot. And I asked the seller, I said, show me which TVs you want to take. Because sometimes they don't want to take, like they're older, they don't want to fool them. So I'll go room by room. And they go, oh, I want to take that one, I'm going to leave that one. I went, okay. I said, for every one you want to take it down now, and take the bracket off. This is before this change, and take the bracket off and patch and paint the holes. I don't want the buyer to see anything. Okay? Okay.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, I don't want them to know what was there, that yeah, you may have to live without a TV in your bedroom for a while, but take it out. Well, now, that's the default. Do you want the buyer to see a bunch of TVs they can't have? You'd be surprised what turns off a buyer sometimes when they see things. But you've got to make sure your buyers know they don't get the flat screen TVs or the brackets now. Make sense?
It's the old chandelier thing.
Yeah.
It's exactly the same.
Anything you want to remove it and replace it with something
Before
else.
it ever goes on the MLS.
Exactly, before they ever see it. I've done that with chandeliers, a lot of times it'll be antique chandelier or a wedding present. Wedding presents are always the worst. And I've had sellers want to remove plants in the ground, trees that were presents. It's like orchids. I mean, okay, it's fine, but take it out now. I don't want the buyers to see it. Does that make sense? You understand? I mean, I think I hate to see this are not included. It's so tacky, and then to walk in and have Post-it notes all over. And this is not included. That's good. Get the stuff out of there. Don't let them see it. I mean, when you walk in a master bedroom, the first thing I do is I look at the bedspread and I look at the windows. Do they match? Mr. and Mrs. Seller, do you want to keep all this? Okay, well, get that stuff off the window because it's otherwise included. Understand? Those are little nitpicky things that can come up. Now, remember, despite checking all these boxes, anything that's a fixture is included in the purchase agreement. The problem is you get these tacky issues over whether some of this stuff is a fixture, whether it's built in or not. Okay? And that's part of the problem. And then they go into, and that's why they've expanded, the definitions of some of the fixtures because of the issues that come up. Just understand, folks, a lot of times when you see these kind of stuff going on here, these changes is because there have been disputes and lawsuits over this stuff. And after you get enough problems, you go, we got to stop this craziness over, stupid little things.
I mean, I was surprised to see the dishwasher. I mean, that never was the case because it's fixed. It's
Dishwashers
never-
are built in.
Yeah.
That's what.
Yeah.
So that's
Could
why
be
I'm
a
saying.
freestanding.
Well, see, here's the thing, folks. Even built-in refrigerators that you think are built in, guess what? I can grab my refrigerator. It looks built in. I can grab it and pull it right out. It still moves in and out, even though it's quote built in.
Yeah, because they've screwed it, same thing like the dishwasher.
Where
Yes.
are they covering solar panels? Because the solar panels are affixed to the roof.
Yeah, it's in the, solar is starts out with whether it's leased, liened, or owned. If it's owned, then
It's permanently, it's part of the fixture, it's part
yeah,
of the
right, yeah.
real property.
Yeah,
On the house I just closed escrow on.
Yeah.
The solar was paid for at the time
Right.
of installation.
yeah. Trying to
They
think.
called up, they wanted some information, I said, look, it's permanently affixed to the roof
Right.
and it's there, it's part of the real property. There's no
I'll
lien.
have to look at that at break and tell you how that, I think it's referenced in the other, in the leased or liened item paragraph.
Could be.
So moving on, so now we're in the allocation of costs. So this is the old paragraph, this Q is your old paragraph 7 in the purchase agreement, where you have the allocated costs with, so we start out with, everything's in a little different, somewhat same order. You got your NHD report, who pays, you check buyer or seller. If you check both, then it says if both is checked, costs will be split equally unless otherwise agreed. So it automatically is a 50-50 split when you check both there. Make sense? Because you couldn't assume, just putting buyer seller, you couldn't assume it meant 50-50. I always put buyer 50%, seller 50%. Well, now if I check both, I don't have to worry about that. The most common 50-50 is going to be your city transfer tax. That's the most common one that's going to be 50-50. Most of these others are going to be 100% one part or the other, usually, okay, generally, customarily. And then over here you check whether it includes environmental and then who it's provided by, if you want to specify who it's provided by. Almost all of them now include environmental in the pretty much standard in the NHG report. Now this is if you want to specify any other reports. The reason this is there is if you want to alert the seller that you want the seller to pay for a specific report. Because the buyer doesn't have to specify reports here, and I don't recommend that you do specify them. The buyer, under the investigation clause, the buyer can have any investigations, any inspections they want at buyer's expense. So you don't have to specify them, and you don't want to. Why? Because you alert the lender to the existence of inspection reports. You don't want lenders knowing that you did a pest control inspection. You don't want them knowing that you did a home inspection. You don't want them knowing you did a foundation inspection. See, as soon as this contract hits a processor's or an underwriter's desk and they see references to reports, they want to see the reports. And when you give them the reports, they want the repairs done.
Before the close of escrow.
Before the close of escrow.
And the buyer can't do it.
And you don't want to go down, we don't want to go down that road. We're not being fraudulent or anything like that. We're only telling them what they need to know. So be very careful with that. I've had offers come in and I cringe. And I pick up the phone. If I think it's the offer I'm negotiating with, I pick up the phone and say, hey, I really like your offer, but you need to rewrite it. Because I don't want references to the inspections. Please rewrite it. It's not going to do me any good to counter it out, because it's still going to be sitting there on the original offer. We got to start over. I know what you meant. You meant well, but not the thing to do. Smoke alarms, carbon dioxide, water heater, buyer, seller, or both. Now, and then there's a provision. There's a provision for buyer. If the buyer offers to pay, there's a provision for the buyer to either put money in escrow to cover the cost, and then a subsequent invoice would be submitted to escrow and be paid out of escrow, or the buyer could pay the vendor direct, and that's in the explanation part of the contract. Now we've got our government required point of sale inspection reports and government required point of sale corrective remedial actions. Again, buyer, seller, or both. Not much different than what we had before. Example of a required point of sale inspection report would be the city of Livermore requires the seller to give the permit history to the buyer, and I think it's up to like $75. I think for that. The first one I ever got, it was $10. Now it's up to like 75. Corrective remedial actions. I mean, the most common ones there are sewer lateral, which right now is in Berkeley, Oakland, Alameda.
Anything covered with the East Bay mud, basically.
Well, that's not that. There's only about 4 cities right now.
Castro Valley.
Yeah, like I said, there's only about 4, I think, that have it. Yeah. And then another is your sidewalk ordinance that Oakland has, and I think Castro Valley has too, I believe. Just a quick reference. Now this question came up, someone in the class I took. There's multiple ways to find out whether any of this stuff applies if you don't already know. The easiest way is to go to the Bay East website and go to the community information, and you can look up each city and it'll tell you what's there. But if you're still in doubt, you can just call the city's building department and they'll tell you what's going on there. Escrow fees, you can check buyer, seller, both, each to pay their own fees. This each to pay their own fees, again, is a Southern California thing. Some of the escrow holders in Southern California have certain fees that they charge the buyer and certain fees that they charge the seller. And so that's why they have that box in there for each to pay their own fees. Because just wait it. Now understand, escrow fee, owner's title insurance policy there's customs within each county as to who customarily pays them. Alameda County is what we call a buyer pay county, meaning the buyer pays the escrow fee, the buyer pays for owner's title insurance. By default, if the buyer's getting a loan, the buyer always pays for the Alta title insurance policy for the lender. But as to owner's title and escrow fee, it's based on custom, and it could still be negotiated otherwise, but customarily, it's the buyer in Alameda County, it's the seller in Santa Clara County. So you got to be careful with Santa Clara agents. They write offers in Alameda County. They're so used to checking the seller box, and you'll get an offer, and then you got to look closer. Go, oh, are they trying to pull a fast one on me, or is their template set up that way? Okay. So you got to make sure, because you could be looking at $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 depending on the price if you don't catch that. So owner's title insurance policy. So over here, you put in escrow holder. You don't have to list the title company if it's different. You list the title company if it's different from escrow holder. Again, this is a Southern California thing. Remember, in Northern California, ABC title. If you put ABC title company for escrow holder, they're both. You don't have to repeat it again. And again, like I said, buyer's lender policy defaults to buyer. Unless otherwise agreed, buyer should purchase any title insurance policy insuring buyer's lender. And that, remember, owner's title insurance policy is going to be based on the purchase, premium is going to be based on the purchase price. Lender is going to be based on the loan amount. There's two different schedules. Everyone familiar with those schedules? Has everyone seen the closing cost schedule? You're all aware of that? Okay. County transfer tax. Typically, in most counties, it's paid by seller. City transfer tax, buyer, seller, both is quite common. HOFEs preparing disclosures. Now it defaults to seller for all documents. The current contract splits it up because there's mandatory documents where the seller has to pay by statute, and then there's additional documents like pet restrictions, smoking restrictions, and those sorts of things that aren't statutory required but are in the contract. Those were negotiable in our existing contract. Well, now they're all under one. The HOA cert fee is defaults to the buyer because that's a document that the lender requires and needs. An HOA transfer fee is negotiable. It could be buyer, seller, or both. And it says unless otherwise agreed, seller should pay for separate HOA move-out fee and buyer should pay for separate move-in fee. Applies if separately billed or itemized with costs and transfer fee. There are some HOAs now that have got these move-in, move-out fees, so that's why that's in there. Typically, if there's a separate charge for transfer and dock, typically it's the buyer paying the transfer fee because that's directly associated with the buyer, the change of their administrative paperwork and billing and so forth from seller to buyer. Private transfer fees defaults to seller or a check. Private transfer fees we don't see much around here. They were imposed by some builders, some out in the valley, and basically they put in a transfer fee that every time the property resold, they got paid money each time. Now they're illegal for any properties built since 2011. Any private transfer fees, but if you have to be careful. Anything built prior to 2011, you might see a private transfer fee. Again, mainly out like in the Central Valley, out there, and particularly more in the southern Central Valley is kind of where my understanding were they were kind of prominent there. So, and they'll be in the preliminary title report. It's very, very obvious in the preliminary title report if it exists. They're not that common, but you just have to be aware of them.
Is this the only place on Q7 that we identify the escrow holder?
Yep.
Okay, because that's an issue here more so than Southern.
Well, the escrow holder isn't the issue. The title company is the issue. See,
But it says right here, title company is different from escrow holder.
right.
So if you identify the escrow holder,
You've identified the title company because they're the same.
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
If you write in escrow holder.
If you put
person there,
Chicago Title Company there, then they're the title company too, because they're not different from the escrow holder.
You
They're the
understand what
same
I'm
one.
saying on this?
Yeah, well, the issue between escrow and title is choice of escrow and title. You gotta remember, under RESPA, you guys all remember RESPA from principles when you study to get your license, you know? Right? And all that stuff that's, you know, way back there in your head that you never thought you'd use again. The seller cannot mandate the use of a particular title company unless the seller pays for the title
But we're
insurance.
ordering pre-sale escrows now.
Well, yeah, but the buyer's still not obligated to go with that
I
company.
know, but if you wanna get your offer accepted right now, you damn well better.
Yeah, we typically, as a practical matter, yeah, yeah. Okay, where are we here? Then if you've got some other fees or costs that need to be identified, you've got the 2 lines for that, home warranty plan, buyer, seller, both, or if there's a waiver, check the box for waiver. Waiver is important because we've got provisions in our E&O policy for reduced deductible, and one of the requirements for to qualify for the reduced deductible is there is a home warranty or there has been a written waiver of the home warranty. That's why it's been in the contract.
If
Because
you
that,
check that box, they can buy it
they still can buy it, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That won't change things from an E&O perspective. And if you got any other terms, then you can put them in there.
Previously, we had the cover sheet that we used to fill, and then that used to populate, you
Yeah.
know, the escrow holder and the title holder.
Yeah.
Is that still the case, or are they gonna?
I don't know, I'm not sure.
Because that was very handy.
Well, I'm sure they're probably gonna still have that same template that you can, allow to populate into this, yeah, I'm sure. Why don't we go ahead, it's 2:05, let's take a break, 10-minute break, we'll resume at 2:15. And then, just so you know, I'm in the exact same place Gov Hutchison was yesterday, after 2 hours.
I'm here to change the settings, so it's not.
So it stays on for a while? Yeah, man, you're making life difficult for me.
Yeah, sorry, whatever.